Hello out there, and welcome to today's Search Engine Journal webinar. I am super excited for today's webinar. With me today, I have SEJ's very own Angie Niklicek with us. And so, Angie, thanks for being here on today's webinar.
Thank you for having me. I am so excited. This is like my favorite subject ever.
And that subject would be, today we're going to be talking about how to perform website experiments. And not only is she going to walk you through the process, she's also going to walk you through one of the most recent experiments that we've done here on our site. And that deals with the ads that we have on our site. So I know she's excited to talk with you about not only the process, but then also, some of the results that we saw from our own experiments. So before I give it over to Angie, I'm going to go through some quick housekeeping. So use hashtag SEJ webinars to share any of today's learnings on social. If you experience any technical difficulties, use the chat box to let us know. There is closed captioning. It's the CC in the top right of your corner, so give that a little click. And if you add your questions to either the chat or the Q&A tab, we're going to do our best to answer some of those at the end. So make sure you send those in. We are going to try to link to any resources that Angie mentions, and there's plenty of them. We're going to try our best to link to them in the chat, but know that you'll actually receive an entire list of those resources at the end of today's webinar when you receive your email that has the recording and the slides. So watch your inbox for that. At the end of today's webinar, we do ask if you can stick around, take our survey. It takes about 30 seconds or so. It just helps us gauge today's webinar and how we can make them more useful for you in the future. So with that, I am going to say, Angie, it's all yours, and I'll be back at the Q&A.
Yay! Thank you so much, Heather, for all of that, and a warm welcome to everybody. Again, this is like my favorite topic, so I'm really excited to talk to you about it. It does tend to get a little dry, but I'm going to do my best to make it fun and informative for you. So let's get started. There are a lot of things that I want to go through today. First, I want to start with our experiment. I want to go through with you and share what we did and how we found out what we found out. And then I'm going to walk you through the entire process, step by step, of setting up and running your own experiment so that you can figure out and learn from your own audience and your own website. All right, so normally I would start a webinar off with, all the reasons as to why what I have to say is important and why, you need to know this stuff. But instead, this time, I'm going to start with a question. So here's your question. If you could only read one news article today, would you choose A, a happy, positive story, or B, a negative, sad story? And I've posed this question for a really specific reason. My goal here is to ignite your curiosity and encourage you to question the things around you and your beliefs. In fact, today, if you learn absolutely nothing else from me, I want you to leave with a newfound appreciation for the importance of challenging your assumptions. And here is why. Heather, do you have some results for us by chance?
I do. They just started coming in. So we've got 85% saying that they would definitely pick the happy story, the positive story.
Yeah, and that's what I thought. Again, many of you said you're going to read a happy and positive story. And unfortunately, I have to tell you that behavioral research says that that's not quite true. Numerous studies have found that we will almost always tell people that we want more positive news stories. But when we actually make that selection and we are actually given the choice, we will routinely choose negative stories first. And this phenomenon raises a really crucial point. Always question your assumptions. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, of course. Let me share with you the latest SEJ experiment. So earlier this year, the topic of ads came up, and our leadership posed a question about ads. Do we have too many of them? Are the ads that we have on the site, are they hurting user experience? And is there some way to find the perfect balance between ads and content that would make all of our readers and SEJ very happy? And that was a pretty good question, I thought. I mean, of course, we all have the answer to that, right? More ads is bad, definitely bad. But when I thought back about it, I couldn't come up with one specific piece of research or study that could prove to me or provided any evidence that more ads are definitely bad for readers. So it was time to do a little bit of research. During my research, I came across a lot of really interesting things that were quite helpful to understand how audiences view and interact with ads. So, for example, user intent influences how individuals view and interact with ads. So, if you're casually, browsing on a website, like say on a social network, users will engage more with ads compared to users who go to a website with a specific goal in mind. So this told me that ads might impact SEJ readers more negatively since all of you guys visit our site with a specific purpose in mind. Research on various ad types indicated that a second or a third ad network could actually positively impact the click-through rates and conversions of the first ad type over time. However, it might decrease those clicks in the short term. Those findings told me that our audience's behavior could change significantly over time, but it also told me that having programmatic and in-house ads on our site at the same time could be highly advantageous for users and for us. The research also revealed that ad repetition really does affect the way users view a site. Essentially, if you view an ad positively, you will view it increasingly more positive the more times you see it. But if you don't like an ad, you will see it as increasingly more negative every time you visit. So, still doesn't tell me how ads affect a website. So I decided to have a little bit of a look at the neuroscience. And it turns out that if your ads match the content that they're displayed alongside, users, when they view and read your site, will process the entire page as a whole. And it increases the attention that they give to the ads, to your content, and to the page overall. But if your ads do not match your content, viewers will process them as two separate parts and actually spend less time on the entire page overall. So that's not good because we want you guys to read and actually enjoy what you're reading. So with that in mind, it was time to come up with our own experiment. First, we needed to know what kind of ads our readers prefer. We hypothesized that our readers only want to see SEJ brand ads that would make them more happy because it matches our content. And as a result, they would spend more time reading and read more pages. But we hypothesized that if we only served programmatic ads, our readers would spend less time on the site because the ads don't match the content, right? They match your previous browsing behaviors. So to find answers in the first phase of our experiment, we randomly assigned our Canadian readers to one of three groups. So that means every time somebody from Canada landed on our site, they would either see only programmatic ads, only SEJ brand ads, or the standard mix of the usual ads that they would normally see when visiting. We let the test run for 2 weeks, and then we were super excited to jump into the analytics. But I got to be honest, we were not expecting what we found. Instead of seeing the number of article reads and pages per session increase for users who no longer saw programmatic ads on the site, users were actually spending less time on the site. When we compared the data collected from these three groups, users overwhelmingly preferred to see both programmatic and SEJ brand ads on the site at the same time. Good news for us, I suppose. We were already doing that, but we're not done yet. We still have another question to answer. Once we knew what type of ads users preferred on the site, we needed to find out what would happen if we reduced the number and the intrusiveness of the ads. We hypothesized that if we reduced the number of ads on the site and removed things like pop-ups, usage of the site would skyrocket. Makes perfect sense, right? Our users would be happier, And I mean, my boss would be happier, which I mean, can't hurt, right? So, like we did before, we set up 3 different groups. The control group of Canadian readers would continue to see our site just like they normally do. The second group, we removed all of the intrusive ads. So anything like pop-ups or anything that would get in the way of content, we got rid of those too. And for our third group of users, we got rid of everything except for the bare minimum of ads. So essentially, they saw only one ad at the top of the site, one ad at the bottom of the site, one little tiny one in the navigation bar, and one side rail. So very minimal. We set that up, let it go, and then we waited. And wouldn't you know it, we didn't see what we expected to see there either. While the average time on site actually looked fantastic, none of the other metrics did. In fact, when we looked at conversions of some of our products from users in these groups with the reduced number of ads, our conversions fell to 0 in some cases. And that's not a good thing to have. So now you're probably wondering what in the heck is going on? Why didn't we get the results we expected? And to be honest with you, I think it's a combination of things. It could be things like the rule of reciprocity and how we trade ad views for free content. It could be things like familiarity and just that when we reduced the sites, it felt weird and made the ads that were there more noticeable. There's a whole range of theories, and I won't go into all of them, but you can find them in the article that we did publish on this experiment last week on the site if you're interested. Heather, if you wouldn't mind sharing that link for me, please. Anyway, regardless of what we found, we were very, very glad that we ran an experiment first before we made a site-wide adjustment and could have experienced a pretty major disaster. It also means that we need more experiments, and between you and me, that makes me pretty happy. So I was good with that. But let's change gears a little bit and show you how you can run an experiment and find insights just like we did. So when you start an experiment, before you get into any of the fun and good stuff, you need to stop and think very carefully about the thing that you want to test. Weigh the costs and benefits. What kind of skills and resources do you need? If it just is running the experiment going to disrupt things for your users? What about other team members or people that you work with on the site? Is that going to cause any issues for them? And will the answers that you find make the time investment into an experiment worth it for you? Once those are all out of the way, you want to think about exactly what it is you're testing. Be extremely precise when identifying exactly what the question is that you're answering, which factors you're going to manipulate, and which elements or variables you are going to measure. And precision is very important. And here's kind of a quick example why. So conversions and clicks, they're not the same thing. A click rate or a click-through rate is a very simple, single, explicit signal from a user based on intent about a decision. Implicit signals are very different. So like conversions, like the article reads and the pages per session that we used with our experiment, that gave us a really good idea and really good insight, not just into the actual clicks that users made, but into their thought processes and how their behaviors changed as things changed on the site. Next, take some time to dig around and see what others have learned about the question you're investigating. Don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. Start with Google and look for case studies and experiments that others in your industry have already done in the past. But don't stop there. Take time to look a little bit deeper. So Google Scholar, for example, Research Rabbit, even other experts in the field who specialize in what you're thinking about or the question that you're asking, all of those are excellent, excellent resources. And most people are more than happy to answer questions if you reach out. So before I go any further, I want to see if you're thinking like scientists. Here's your question. In October of last year, a Minnesota plant nursery tested rewriting a group of pages and fixing thin content on their website as a result. But as a result, their traffic fell. If this was you and if this was your website, would you A, put the old content back, or B, leave the new content? Now, I'll come back to the answer to this in a minute, but in the meantime, I want to talk to you about variables and what you'll be working with. In any experiment that you run, there's going to be 3 types of variables. The independent variable is what you are manipulating. That is the potential cause of the thing that you are measuring. So in our experiment, for example, this was ads, but in your case, this might be content or links or even keywords. Dependent variables are the specific things you are measuring. So in our case, page views, bounce rates, article reads, time on site, all of those things are dependent variables that are changing because of the thing that we manipulated. In your case, this could be something as simply as just traffic numbers. It doesn't have to be complex, but it does need to answer your question. The third one, confounding variables, that's the one that is a lot less visible and gets a whole lot more problematic. These are the things that affect both your independent and your dependent variables at the same time. So in other words, they influence what you are changing and what you are measuring both. So here's some quick examples of confounding variables you might run into while you're running your experiments. I am not going to read the whole list, and it's by no way an exhaustive list, but it's at least a pretty good idea of what you can look for or what to expect. In all, these are the things most likely to affect the outcome of your experiment and lead you down the wrong path. 9 times out of 10, when you make a mistake with your experiment and your data doesn't work out, it's because of one of these reasons. So there are 2 different types to watch for. There are external confounds. So these are things like social shares, anything outside factor, links, anything that comes from the outside of your website that affects your data. But you have to be careful because with website, there are a lot of internal confounds to watch out for as well. So this is things like the type of content, for example, the language used, elements on the page like images. All of these things all are going to affect your data. So how do you know that it's a confound and how do you know that the confound matters? When you go through your data, if removing the effects and the data associated with those confounds changes your data by more than 5%, it's a confound and it's going to be a problem. But just as a quick aside, what happens if it's too late? What happens if you run your experiment and you find out that there's a confound affecting your data? Unfortunately, when this happens, there's no real quick way to fix it outside of just redoing your experiment. However, if you do dabble in a bit of coding or statistics, you can use Python or R and what's called regression modeling to help you kind of estimate what all the impacts or what the value of those impacts might be. It sounds really scary, looks really complicated, but it's actually exceptionally easy. I suggest using Free Code Camp if that's something that you're interested in learning. And if you forget the name of the website, don't worry about it. We'll include that in the follow-up email after the webinar. Anyway, bottom line, regardless of how much a confound affects your results, you should try to eliminate them as much as possible. So let's look at some examples of confounds. Let's go back to the question I posed earlier about the Wisconsin plant nursery in October. Heather, do you have those results for us by chance?
I do. And so we've got petering out with about 67% saying leave the new content in. Only a third says put the old content back.
Yeah. So, in this case, putting the old content back might actually be a pretty significant problem. And here's kind of why. If you live in Wisconsin in October, you'll know that plant nursery traffic will naturally decline in the fall because you can't grow things outside. So if you had ran your study for only a week during, when it was getting colder out, chances are it would mess up your experiment and you'd have the wrong answer. If you aren't quite sure about confounds yet and you're still, it seems kind of confusing, I do have a resource that's really super easy to follow and understand if you're new to experiments. Heather, if you wouldn't mind sharing that as well. Thank you. And if you're thinking that confounds are tricky and really hard to catch, you'd be right, because even experts make this mistake all the time. And here's an example I came across this weekend. It's a meta-analysis that found evidence that fast food causes poor mental health in children. Essentially, what they're saying is people who serve their children more fast food also have more of a chemical in their body that has been tied to things like depression and anxiety in children. Makes perfect sense. But what the researchers failed to consider when they did a lot of these experiments is that people who work all the time or have low socioeconomic status and are more likely to serve fast food are also more likely to be dealing with a lot more stress and anxiety-inducing situations. This is compounded by the fact that they have less time with their kids because they're working all the time. You're also less likely to be preparing a home-cooked meal when you're depressed, anxious, or just exhausted. So how could their children not statistically experience more anxiety, depression, and exhaustion? Does this mean that fast food doesn't contribute to poor mental health? Of course not. But it doesn't make it evidence of it either. And even if this is evidence of it, statistically, the contribution of fast food to depression would be so small compared to everything else that can cause depression that the effects of fast food would be next to nothing. And the same thing can happen in your experiments. So, I mean, of course, experiments aren't just about spotting good confounds. And I mean, there are some other lessons in this example for you. Even if your experiment ends up with confounds in it, it doesn't necessarily mean that your experiment is wrong or that the answers that you found was wrong. It just means that you're not quite to the answer that you need yet. And no matter what you find in your experiment, make sure that you consider it on a higher level. How do your findings fit into the bigger picture? You might have evidence of something, but that doesn't always mean that it's going to have the impact that you think it will. And that brings us back to the very first thing I talked to you about when it comes to making your experiments. Make sure that you think about the costs and benefits of your experiments and the payoffs before you start running them. You're also going to need to consider your sample. Your sample needs to be random and unbiased and large enough to provide you with valid results. I won't go into all of the statistic things, but essentially what big enough means is that you're dealing with regression to the mean. You have to make sure that it's not biased one way or another. And by biased, what I mean is that you need to make sure that you have a good mix of traffic or a good selection of pages or even a good selection of keywords with a mix of intents and audience. It should reflect the population that you're studying and the population that you intend to use your results with. So as an example, let's say that you're testing a landing page and you want to see whether a blue or a red call to action is better. As you go through your experience, let's say that you find out that the traffic that comes from search engines prefers the red button, and the traffic that comes from social prefers the red button. If you don't have a good mix, you're not going to be able to find those patterns, but you're also going to end up with data that is tainted or biased to one side or the other, leading you down the wrong path. And that is absolutely not what you want to have happen. So how do you know if you have enough data for accurate answers? I'm going to be really honest with you. The actual formula for calculating a sample size, a little bit scary. It's not easy to work with, has a lot of moving parts. However, you can get around this really easily by just looking for online calculators and resources that can help you quickly calculate all of that stuff to figure out how much traffic you need for a good data sample. So these calculators actually do appear right in the search results if you search for them, but Heather also has a couple of links for you to a power calculator and a sample size calculator that makes it really quick and easy. All right. So the next question you need to answer is when you are going to run your experiment and for how long. Let's say that you sell software that does marketing reporting, software for marketing reports, and you decide to experiment tracking traffic changes for 1 week at the beginning of the month. And if that's you, I've got really bad news for you. That's going to contain some really unpleasant data, and you're going to have to start over. Why? Because as marketers, SEOs, and business people, you all know that you do your reporting at the beginning of the month on the previous month's traffic and sales. And that's also when you are more likely to get frustrated and go looking for an alternative. That results in a natural increase to the traffic on your software website and throws absolutely everything off. So in this situation, you might want to consider running your experiment later in the month or over a period of several months. Even better though, compare your test data against a control group rather than comparing traffic across time. Now, if you've looked at websites and SEO experiments before, you'll have likely heard of something called an SEO timing test. So essentially what this does is you'll take 6 weeks or several months worth of traffic before you make your change and compare it to the same amount of period or same period of time after you've made a change. Makes perfect sense, but that timing difference does matter and it can make huge differences in your findings. So not something I particularly recommend, although I do know that quite a few people do use it. But here is something that I do recommend other than a comparative time-based SEO task, or even a lot of the SEO exploration tests that people do. These designs that I've got here on this slide are going to give you much better results. So the type of experiment that you choose is going to ultimately depend on the question that you're trying to answer. There are some adjustments and alternatives, though, that you can use depending on what kind of constraints you have. So if you need to keep costs down, for example, using a multi-arm bandit test, which weighs traffic towards the winning condition rather than just a straight A/B test, might be a better option for you because you lose fewer sales that way. Another option is using a within subject design. So what that means is you're comparing the exact same traffic and the exact same visitors before and after a change rather than comparing between groups or across time. It uses fewer resources. Does tend to take a little bit more time, but fewer resources. So there's a list there. Those will also be in the email that comes in the follow-up. So don't panic writing all of those down. There is one last thing you are going to have to think about before you can run an experiment, and that's your data. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make all of the darn time, and I personally have made it, I don't know how many times, is that I fail to plan the data that I'm going to use and how I'm going to collect it. The result being that you fail to collect the data that you actually need, or you collect a whole bunch of absolutely useless data that doesn't actually tell you anything. So how do you fix that? I'm going to recommend that you use a system similar to what we use when we build our state of SEO reports. It's also one of the standard organizational methods that data scientists will often use to find answers. And here's how it works. You start with your original research question, and then you list out all of the things that you need to know in order to answer that question properly. And then underneath each one of those, you figure out what data and what things do you need to collect in order to answer those parts. So it ends up being kind of like an informational pyramid, if you will, with all of the bottom layers feeding into the top layers to answer that ultimate question. The other thing that you want to plan for when you're doing your experiment is that you need to plan to succeed, and you also need a plan for what to do when your experiment fails. In our experiment, for example, we wanted to publish our findings, so we decided to pull and track a couple of extra metrics that would help us create a really nice cohesive story and help people understand kind of what we did and what we found in a nice and easy reader-friendly way. What we didn't do, though, is we did not plan for our experiment to fail, and that ran us into trouble. We could have easily tracked a couple of extra metrics that would have given us a little bit better direction or have held some really good clues as to a little bit more what was going on underneath the surface. So don't make that mistake. Make sure that you plan to fail as well as plan to succeed. Now, That seems like a lot of things to remember with all the data, right? And it definitely can be. But the trick to managing all of that and keeping track of everything is having the right tools. So decide ahead of time what programs you want to use and what kind of software you want to not only plan and record everything that you do with your experiment, and you're going to want to record everything that you think through and every decision that you make when you perform an experiment. But you also want to actually run. You also want software that helps you actually run and handle your experiment, collect the data, and help you analyze it after. I know this is another really big list, but these are just a few of the options that you have available, and we'll make sure that those are in that follow-up email that come. So in case you haven't noticed, I'm a particularly big fan of R and Python. Being able to use the data that you collect and build models and make predictions gives you a much better idea of how everything interacts and how you can get more from it. And I cannot tell you how many times I've come across some kind of insight that I didn't know was there until after I did the modeling. They're both free. Both, it's surprisingly, shockingly easy to learn. I think I learned in like 2 or 3 days. So even if you're not a coder or a data person, I highly suggest having a look. They have prevented so many mistakes that they are absolutely worth their weight in gold. So with all of that done and all of that covered, you are finally ready to run your experiment. So I know it's a ton of data, a ton of information. And again, we're going to include everything in a special resource that comes to you in your follow-up email. But let's do a quick recap anyway. So number one, start your experiment by deciding if you should run an experiment and if the findings will have enough ROI to make it a good use of your time and your resources. Secondly, be very, very, very clear about what it is you're attempting to find out and how exactly you're going to do it. Number three, do your research. I cannot express this enough. Other people are also looking, and if you have a question, other people likely have the same question. So look around, talk to other people, connect with industry experts. Even if you have to go to a university and say, hey, look, this is my problem and I found this, can you explain it to me? People are happy to help and they're happy to give you their insights. Fourth, define your variables. Be very, very clear about exactly what it is you are measuring and exactly why you are measuring it. 5, identify any confounding factors that might throw off your test. Remember that these can be a bit tricky, but ultimately identify anything that might affect the thing you are manipulating and the thing you are measuring. And if you really aren't sure, don't be afraid to give your experiment to somebody and say, hey, look, what did I miss? Because chances are, if you've been working and developing this experiment, you're not going to be able to see it because you've been in it for too long. Step 6, determine what you're going to use as your sample to test on, when you're going to run your experiment, for how long you are going to run your experiment, and what kind of experimental design to use. 7, plan not only what kind of data you need to test and use your findings, but also plan out how you are going to analyze your data and how all those pieces fit together. Step 8, choose your tools for every step of the experimental process before you start. Decide what you want to use to document your experiment, how you'll track and collect the data, and how you'll analyze the data and disseminate your findings before you start to avoid having to go back and redo things. Because trust me, it sucks and you're not going to be very happy with yourself. Step 9, analyze your data. And step 10, implement your findings and start over. Now, normally I would end this talk right here. But I want to go through one more thing with you because I really want to make sure that when you leave here, that you are not only inspired and full of ideas, but you have lots of easy ways that you can start experiments and stretching your scientist muscles. So here's a few. Headlines and call to actions. So whether you're publishing content, whether you're an e-commerce store or a service provider, no matter what you do online, Headlines and call to actions are one of the quickest and easiest ways you can practice your experiments, and you can implement and get a really nice big payoff. Simply run them with an A/B test and track their success using all of the metrics that you already have in GA4. Image types is another item that you might want to test. Images are fun because they not only affect whether or not people will click through to your website, but they also affect whether or not people will stop and read, whether or not they'll click on something while they're there, as well as how they view your brand, your website, and the content. So again, images are another really great thing to test with very minimal cost and a pretty high impact. You can also track them using nothing but your GA4. So testing is one of those things. I'm going to preface this by saying that testing your targeting is something that people will often ignore because it looks really hard to test and it looks really complicated, but it isn't, or at least it's not as bad as people think it is. Simply set up an existing page and then create a second version that you think is better targeted to a very specific audience. Run them on an A/B test. And when you're done, go through your analytics and see whether the type of people that you expected to be clicking and converting are actually doing that. And now this one is my favorite. In the mid-90s, a guy by the name of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi said that the biggest mistakes that website owners make is that they think of their websites as a destination rather than a journey or an experience. That they forget about their audience as soon as they have them on the page. And this still happens now, even 30 years later after he said that. In fact, I'm willing to bet that this is the one thing that your competitors are testing and aren't checking. But now that you've been to this webinar, you can. Rather than testing elements on the page, test the steps in a customer's journey. When they land on your homepage, for example, what is a certain type of visitor's next step? Where do they go next? If they're done reading an article or looking at a product, what do you want them to do next? Test different options and variations in that journey with different audiences to see if you can find the right mixture that works best for you and for your audience. And as an added bonus, by doing the same thing, you can figure out which journeys will end up with the higher average customer value. All right, I know that was a lot, but I hope that you were all able to find something of value in today's presentation. And I want to thank you so much for joining me and letting me share my love and passion for experiments. It is absolutely one of my favorite things to do ever. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I'll invite Heather to join us so that we can answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Angie. And yeah, if you don't follow Angie on social or you don't know, this is absolutely her favorite thing to talk about. So she's, thank you for sharing your knowledge with everybody out here. But we do have some good questions, so let's get to them. So first and foremost, a question came in from Jim. Angie, can you explain what an ABN test is?
Okay, so I think you all are pretty familiar with a basic A/B test. So you essentially have a control group and you're testing it against another variation. An ABN test is essentially the exact same thing, except you might be testing more than one variation. The only thing to keep in mind with an ABN test is that you have to have a fair amount of traffic, or you have to have a fairly big sample. Because the more variations you have, the more traffic you're going to need to make those results accurate.
So we have a few questions coming in. So just for everybody, I know there was a ton of information in here. You will absolutely get the recording, the slides, and a whole host of resources that Angie already put together. So that will all be in your email. So watch later for that. So Lisa asks a question. Do you see differences when we're talking about our test specifically and what we ran? Do you see differences between desktop and mobile audiences?
So there were in some of the in some of the versions that we tested, in some of the groups, between some of the groups, there was some minor differences, but not like you would be expecting to see. So, for example, on a mobile screen, for example, ads at the top of the screen would actually push the content down further on the screen than they would on the desktop. But we actually found that mobile users went way farther and read far more than what our desktop users were using. And that was it didn't matter what browser type they were using. It was all more ads definitely seem to improve mobile, which I don't know. I got nothing. I can't tell you. I have a bunch of theories, but I have no definite answers because I don't know.
But yes, to answer the question, you should absolutely, there may be differences between mobile and desktop. So if you're doing your own testing, make sure you're looking at them separately.
Yeah, absolutely. Even different browsers is huge because Mac will often, Safari and Mac will often change the way that page looks, right? So it matters. It does.
So IH asks, and I love this question, for a complete website redesign, how should we approach testing?
So the first thing I would do is I would kind of mark out and kind of map out what you think your trouble spots are. Why are you redesigning it? Is there something that's not working? And I would absolutely test those first, but I'm going to be very, very stern here and say don't just test two whole entire web redesigns because that's not going to work. Because you're not going to have any idea exactly what it is that's making the difference. Test and change one element at a time. And the other thing I'd like to mention is that when you do a website redesign, if you actually drastically change the design of your website, what you test on your original site is not necessarily going to be the same if you test it on your new website. So my suggestion would be to, redesign your site, fix or, attempt to fix what you think you need to fix, and then test that by just testing one piece of it at a time. So if it's like, if your contact form isn't working, for example, or you think that it's preventing users, just test your contact form. Then you can go back from there and work on the journey to the contact form. Don't test everything at once. You're going to be really unhappy with yourself.
And to that point, Anna just put a question in. It said, what are some of the best practices, in your opinion, with testing the contact form? So stay there a minute. How would you look at that?
So I think it's important to, when you're designing your contact form, to think about what you need and what you actually don't need. So for example, if you set up and just collect a name and an email, for example, you can use really simple coding to figure out how big those companies are, right? You don't have to ask what industry they're in. That should be in there, right? So try to multi-purpose as much as you can. Remember why you want the contact form, right? So if I'm a service provider, what exactly is it that I have to know in order to start that conversation? Don't ask for a full life history all in one. Generally speaking, the shorter that form is, the better it's going to convert for you. And you are going to do a better job than your website at getting that information. Doesn't matter how good your information is, people like humans, and you're going to do a better job at collecting that information than your website. Make sure that you have tooltips, for example, in the boxes where people need to fill things out, because what happens is they go to fill out a contact form and they click in it and then they get distracted and they walk away and they can't remember what goes in that box. And rather than figure it out, they'll just close. So those are all types of different tips. The other thing is your submit button. Make sure that you might want to test the color and make sure that you test the text on it, because every different audience will react differently to a different call to action on that button. And the other thing is, don't think just about the form, but think about where they go when they are done submitting that form. Nothing is more disappointing to me as somebody who kind of really loves testing and really loves usability and user experience, is when I click submit and I submit a great big form that I just spent a bunch of time on, and then it goes absolutely nowhere. that doesn't help me any. Make sure that it goes somewhere, and it goes somewhere that matters.
Thank you pages are extremely important, right, Angie? Absolutely.
Absolutely.
All right. Lots of questions coming in. I don't know that we're going to be able to get to all of them. So we might have to look at like a Q&A roundup or something. But few questions are on A/B testing. So Elaine asks, can you walk through how to test for improving rankings and clicks that isn't A/B testing? Google doesn't usually crawl variants.
No, Google doesn't usually crawl variants. The big thing for me when you're testing variants of your keywords is that different users will use different forms depending on who they are and what it is you're offering. So, for example, we had a really good article a little while back on whether or not you should have singular or plural keywords, for example. So when I'm testing and I'm doing different things like that, it's not so much Google and the ranking that I'm testing as much as who is coming through those keywords, because that tells me what the rest of that journey should look like, right? So if I have a hair salon website, the words that I use there, if I want, say, higher paying rich ladies, for example, I'm going to use slightly different language and slightly different keywords because they are going to search for different keywords, right? It's all about thinking about how that user is behaving and what you want. Because I mean, you can rank for just about anything, but ranking isn't going to help you if it's not actually paying off when they get to the website. And it's not, if you, I don't know, if you have something about long hairstyles, but the keywords that you're using is attracting, young men with short hair, it's not going to pay off for you. So that's usually where I do a lot of my testing. And again, I will rank a keyword and I will watch that traffic that's coming through. And if it's not it's not what I want, or it's not what I think, I'll switch it. Another thing is that you can launch two pages that are similar and rank them both for different keywords and see which one gets the better traffic. So you're still kind of doing an A/B test, but it's not a traditional, where you're offering two variants kind of thing.
Perfect. So Eli asks, these are two different ones. So Letty asks, which data modeling tool did you learn in 2 or 3 days? Was it Python? And then let's couple that with Eli was asking, where can a complete beginner begin to learn data analysis like R in Tableau?
Okay, so this is going to sound really bad, and I'm sorry, but so I learned R because I had no other choice. I was in school, and he said, he gave us a great big project, and he said, by the way, it needs to be done in R, and you have to code it in LaTeX, and it's due Friday. And this was like a Wednesday afternoon, so it was kind of a emergency. I have no idea how to code anything, so it was a bit of a quick learn. For example, yeah, I spent a lot of time on Free Code Camp. Free Code Camp is pretty much where I learned most of my stuff. They are fantastic, and they have a cool little tool that lets you code and you can kind of see the results without actually affecting anything, right? So I didn't have to worry about it. So yeah, so I actually learned R first, and then I was working on something else, and it had to all be coded in Python. And believe it or not, at least for me personally, I found that R and Python and JavaScript and a bunch of the other languages are all very similar. So when you understand how one works, it's pretty quick and easy to pick up all of the other ones. And what was the other question, Heather? I'm sorry.
Where should a complete beginner begin to learn data analysis tools like R and Tableau?
Yeah, absolutely. I would absolutely start with Free Code Camp. I cannot praise those guys enough. It's all free, it's all open source, and they have so many different courses and things that you can go to. And Coursera also had a couple of like complete beginner data science courses that were absolutely fantastic. I've heard really good things about Google's data science courses, but I didn't take data science with Google and I didn't learn any of that with Google. I just did there was a really nice class with Google's head of data science, data visualization. He was brilliant. But I haven't actually tried Google's courses, but heard good things.
Awesome. Yeah, David says that learning to code isn't as difficult as people think.
No.
It's easier than learning a verbal language.
No. I would, having learned several languages, both speaking and, computer coding, I would definitely do the coding hands down, like not even a comparison. Way easier. Once you learn the basic concepts, all of the other languages come really easy. They're all pretty much the same.
Okay, so let's see. What type of samples do you recommend for testing A/B test pages for organic traffic?
What kind of samples? So if I were planning a sample to test like an entire page, I'm looking for a really good mixture of people. So if this is something that's completely untested, I would try something. It's called like it's called a hallway test. At least like in usability, you call it a hallway test. You essentially just go to a complete stranger and you're like, hey, look, can you please go through this website, or can you please go through this app for me? Please go through this page for me. Get them to, accomplish, certain goals, whether that's, sign up for a book or whatever it happens to be. That gives you a really good idea of what that test page should look like, or at least what your A/B test should look like. And then when I'm selecting samples, I am looking for a really, really good mix. So I want people from social. I want people from an email list. I want people I know. I want to make sure that they have different jobs, so that, we don't have just people that are really, marketing and ad savvy. I want to make sure that we have a really, really good mix. And if I find as I'm going through my sample that, we have a ton of people from social, but we have nobody from search, for example, I will actually make changes and do what I need to kind of, adapt that sample to make it a little more well-rounded.
Cleo is welcome in every meeting, and she's welcome in our webinar today. I hope we didn't blow her cover, like if she's like in witness protection or anything. I'm sure she's fine.
Oh, she hears your voice and then she has to come and see. It's like every time I'm in a meeting with you.
I got that. I got that. They just love me. All right. So let's see. Letty asks, in GA4, do you have a preferred report or view that can help with data collection for testing?
I don't. So far, since we've made the switch, I've been kind of making and fiddling around with my own, just because I find that I'm very precise and I'm very particular about what it is I'm looking at. So I'm looking at a specific page from a specific source within a specific time period. And it's not that you can't, but I'm comparing it with a lot of different stuff that maybe most normal people don't compare it with. So yeah, I usually kind of custom my dashboards, or I build a dashboard, or I pull the data and build something myself.
That's for a whole nother webinar that we could talk about that. Harsha had a good question. Besides saying this is a great session, can you tell me if it's better to run a test with less variations and small groups with multiple tests, or go with multiple variations with large groups so that we don't have to run multiple tests?
Yeah, no, I know that a lot of people really like multivariate testing because they can test all of these big changes and they can do it all at once. But the problem that you run into is an image on a website can change absolutely everything. It will change everything from how they view your brand, how long they are on the site, what they pay attention to, what they click on, even what they're looking for. So in behavioral science, there's this thing called priming. And basically, you introduce an idea. So let's say the color blue, or let's say, make money now, whatever. You're introducing some kind of concept or some color or something ahead of time. And then when they click through and they go to the next page, they're going to be looking for make money now, something blue. It carries over, right? It matters from page to page. So when you're doing multivariate testing and you're changing a whole bunch of things all at once, you have no way to control how all those different changes are affecting other things, right? So if you change a headline, for example, that can very quickly and very easily change who's actually reading. So it can change, the time on site and all of these other things. But if you've also changed the color of the website, the buttons, the images, and all these other things, you can attribute it to one thing. As soon as you have to guess, like, it's over. You're no longer experimenting. You're essentially just guessing.
Yeah. Let's see if we have time for one more, Angie.
Sure.
Leon says, this is back to contact forms, but contact forms are so important.
I love contact forms. You can do
I
the
do
coolest
too.
things with contact forms.
I agree. So Leon asks, we have a lot of people who fill in the first part of the contact form, but stop halfway there. Any tips on how we can fix this? I don't think A/B testing would be an option. We don't get a gigantic amount of traction.
Yeah, so that's particularly a big problem when you get to longer contact forms. One of the smartest, I think, ways as a user and as somebody who works on websites, one of the smartest routes to go is to break that up. So, you'll have one or two questions there, and then, hey, a little bit more on one or two questions, and then a little bit more on one or two questions. And the reason being is because us humans, we really have this thing about loss aversion and time investment. So once we invest a little bit of time, or we've already given you part of that data, we're not going to quit without finishing. Or I shouldn't say that. We're less likely to quit without finishing because you've already invested some time and some information, right? So by busting that up, you can extend that through really, really nicely in a nice almost journey. Another way to think about doing it is reduce your contact form, reduce the number of fields on it, and get something in the follow-up. Make something that is so irresistible in that follow-up that comes with something of genuine value that they're going to be willing to fill that out, right? And if you can eliminate fields, even better.
I like tools that have like dynamic forms. So if they come back, let's say they filled out the form the first time and they gave you like 3 pieces of information, the next time they come back, ask them 3 different pieces of information. That way they're not giving you the same things over and over again. That can really help with conversion rates too.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to do
Awesome.
we need to do a webinar on contact forms.
Oh, I would, yes. My biggest thing about contact forms is if you are asking for the data, make sure you're using it.
Yeah.
Don't ask for it just to ask for it, or for profiling. How are you using it? So, very important.
There's
All right.
so many people that collect all that data, and there's so many good things hidden in it. Like, compare it with your analytics, compare it with what's going on your website.
Absolutely. All right, Angie. Well, with that, we are almost at the top of the hour. So this is my favorite question. Angie, tell the people where to find you.
Oh, so I am on Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it these days, at juxtacognition.com, or Twitter at juxtacognition. And I'm also Angie Nikolchuk on LinkedIn and on Facebook. So that's kind of where I hang out, nerd out, and share stuff.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody who attended, who registered for this webinar and is watching it on demand. We hope you got out of it what you needed to. But if you do have any questions, you can find us over at searchenginejournal.com. Make sure you subscribe to our newsletter so you know what webinars are coming up next. Stick around for the survey. And with that, we're going to get out of here. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we will see you at the next SEJ webinar. Have a great day. Bye. Thanks, Angie.
Thank you.